Okay, okay. Sorry if you got that buzz, that loud buzz. I'm a nutty professor over here. Okay, so um, this is the first of what I think will be a series of these. And it might be the kind of thing where in the future, when I do these sorts of talks, we do it via something like Zoom, since the singing part tends to be more problematic with things like Zoom. The talking and conversation seems to go better with those sorts of platforms. Um, but I figured today what we could do is I could just kind of go through my history and points along my career and things I've done over the years, failures, triumphs. And as you have questions, you can either use the YouTube uh, comment section or you can use VC. Either one is totally fine. I've got them both open, so I'm looking and watching. Um, but yeah, the intention with these is for it to be a conversation, um, a back and forth of sorts, where we can talk about what's going on collectively and individually to a certain degree, um, and hopefully make it more of that sort of conversant dialogue as opposed to me just talking at you. So, let me see, let me make sure I got everything right. Uh, and please do let me know if for some reason I'm too soft in the mic or whatever. Okay. So, I've been thinking about the topic of breaking through emotional barriers because one of the biggest things that comes up when I speak with folks over the years, wherever I go, tends to have to do with questions about not only just techniques with singing and music, but creative flow, um, finding one's own unique voice in the vast spectrum of that which has already been said. Okay, great. Good. I finally dialed in this mixing console and I have stuff cranked up so that way there's no question about, hopefully, there's no question about volume. Um, but really, the part of my calling, I think, is not just that I'm a singer, but that I am a multifaceted person who lives creatively. Another thing I would say before I really get into it is I welcome note taking. I'm recording this like the other sessions, so that way, if you want to have access to it later, you can go back and review topics. And as I've been prepping for this first conversation of what will be hopefully be many, I just bullet pointed out some kind of, I guess, cliff notes or chapters in this conversation. Um, but over the years, I've had the opportunity to teach on multiple levels. I've done lectures at universities. I taught ceramics after getting my BFA in the fine arts at an art school for middle school age kids. But so much of education in my life and in my experience is that it's about things outside of academia, going more for a tribal or communal sharing of knowledge, a sharing of stories. And I think I can speak very confidently to the idea that the greatest teachers in my life have not been in schools. I certainly have memorable relationships with teachers who I regard as heroes. But, once I got my BFA in the fine arts, I was ready to go out and experience the world. And so, with that being said, life experience has been the greatest teacher. Um, so, with that being said, I'll just start from kind of where I came from and the beginnings of my history, and then I move forward from there. Uh, One of the big things was when I was a baby. I was born. I had perfect pitch. Mom was studying voice at Florida State School of Music. Had a voice coach that told her that I was learning her lessons faster than she was, um, and that I needed to be in a gifted program for music. And she tried that, and I remember vividly hating it at 2 and 3 years old. And they finally were like, well, this might not be the right place for him. And my mother didn't push it. And in some ways, over the years, I thought, oh man, I wish I could have, uh, been pushed to go to Juilliard or something like that. However, I think the beauty in that decision was one of allowing me to find my own voice. There's a great film I watched the other night on this guy, Stanislaw Szoslasky. I'm mispronouncing that name, I'm sure. It's on Netflix. It's called Struggle. And his father vehemently, this stuck out to me, was like, he will not be made to conform to the standards of Western education. And the guy had his own language, and he was this incredible world-building artist who was just born with innate talent. And there was so much of that in which I related to it, especially in the way in which his father specifically gave him the freedom and the guidance. It was freedom and guidance. And I think in my life, looking back, one of the great virtues that has aided me over the years was the fact that my parents were supportive, but they were never impositional with their ideas. Like I remember flat out asking, because they never told me, I was like, what do you want me to be? And mom and dad laughed about it. I don't know. We always thought it'd be kind of neat if you were a musician, But it was more like that, but it was years later. They encouraged me to do well in school, but they didn't push too hard. And, in some ways, I could have probably afforded benefiting from a little bit more of that push. However, I do believe in the idea that nothing is wasted in this life. And in that regard, with this path of mine, the fact that they gave me freedom to find myself and to take risks gave me the confidence to take risks in my own right. Both of my parents were theatrical. They never professionally pursued music or the arts. However, they had a love of it, and they participated on the amateur level in terms of plays, musicals, theatrical productions, and they would write and sing music together for friends, family, community. And I grew up in the church, so we had that strong community of people who were all there, and they loved my parents and what they were doing. And so I think bearing witness to that growing up, it definitely afforded me a lot of the same kinds of cues as to how to, branch out and do the same thing for myself. Excuse me one second. Oh, a question. A friend wants to know which ticket to buy for this session. Let's see. It's called Breaking Through Emotional Barriers. And please feel free to interrupt me with this one, because this is more of a Q&A. How about I just send this link to, let's see. I'm going to send it in Messenger to this person. Facebook. I'll just send it to you directly to you, Aaron, and then because I can't find him. If he just clicks on that, he can go to the ticket link. Okay. So all right. And so, yeah, I think that thing of the freedom of expression along with support. So when I did fail, I remember the first thing that comes to mind right off the bat was being in a play about the Nativity when I was 5, and Dad made a robe for me that was too long, and I tripped on the stairs, and it was so embarrassing. I remember the staff that I had clacked on the stage steps going up, and it was mortifying. I can still vividly see my little hand in the staff hitting the steps, and they were wood, and it echoed throughout the whole church sanctuary space, and people were gasped. and I was mad because he'd made the robe too long, and I remember Mom even telling him, "Hand that, he's gonna trip on it." But at the end of the day, I came back from that, and I had my parents there to provide the support that I think is really important in those years. And in talking with people, I think that kind of secure attachment is very important. So even if it's not our biological parents, one of the things that I think is a very important part is to think about those people. And I would invite you to write this down in a journal. Who are the people that supported you in your life, that you think of as parental figures or guidance peoples? Um, and certainly, my parents had their limitations, and where they were limited, I naturally gravitated towards other men and women who provided those gaps. And I believe, and I've talked about this with people too, that, we're in an age when the idea of tribe and community is so segmented and disconnected. And so we kind of have to, in our lifetimes, seek out and sift through to find people who we can have as those voices in our lives that provide secure attachment, support, feedback that is loving in its pain as much as it is in its pleasure. And so when I think back, before the age of, let's say, 13, there were key people that I still think of to this day that I call forward into my mental space, or that I write to in my journals, thanking them for the examples that they gave me. And that's been a big one. It's like, especially when they pass and they're no longer living, I still call them into the room, like one would evoke the ancestors or call in their ancestors when on the hunt or facing a foe. And these are things that I think are innately a part of us as Homo sapiens. This sort of dynamic is just in our DNA. So in this day and age, when we have so many tools at our disposal, which can also be distractions, having those people in our mind's eye and in our hearts really can help us in terms of our compass and our navigation. Is this a choice that would serve the path that I'm on? Is this a choice that would distract? Do I need to be distracted for a little while? That's okay too. Sometimes we take these long scenic routes through things and we're like, why the hell did I do that? But I think it's all necessary. That's why I say in caps, nothing is ever wasted. Recently, Mom talked about it like GPS. We might take a right turn when we should have taken a left according to the fastest direction. However, in taking that right, that little blue line continues to always guide us back to where we need to be. So in that regard, and this is a big one that's hard, I think, for many of us, is that we find ourselves in the rat race to make it, quote unquote, make it by a certain age in the arts or in our careers. And of course, there is the timeline of age. However, the greatest masters in Japanese samurai culture didn't attain their samuraihood until they turned 50. Akira Kurosawa made his first major motion picture at the age of 50, The Seventh Samurai. At least that piece he made when he was 50 years old, if I'm not mistaken. Always check my math. But I tend to abide by the idea in my walk in life that it isn't about the destination as much as it is about the journey. And the path, and all of those things that come up along the path that we could have never expected. And so in my history, like many of us, I look at pop culture and you see this, what I would refer to as this cult of youth, where we're obsessed with the next youngest, best thing, when in fact that's so counterintuitive to the natural process of life. All good things take time. Nature takes its time. And everything is accomplished, and so I think it's important to give ourselves that emotional hug and say, you know what, I'm taking as long as I need to take to get to this point, and nobody else has a say in that. People can point out things, just like learning. Hey, if you use the tool this way, you'll be a lot more efficient, and those are always great. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that we need to take as long as we need to take Um, so going back to the history of it, I'd say between the ages of 5 and 13, it was really just about relationship building. It was realizing that I had certain gifts, and when I spoke out with those gifts in ways that were damaging, I got to come back and cry about it with Dad. Um, and I won't go into specifics on that, but I will say that in those first 13 years of life, it really was about finding a kind of spectrum of behavior that was what society expected, and then what really, I think, what spirit expected. And those two, for me, are a constant a dance back and forth of, surfing the waves of societal expectation and norms, while first and foremost honoring what my spirit compels me to do time and again. And so, with that being said, one of the pieces of information that really hit me was when I think the Dalai Lama said in an interview that the key to enlightenment in the 21st century was to listen. And that was like a lightning bolt. I had started writing a series of operatic experiences in the year 1998, 99. And in terms of the history, I think, by the time I turned 15 and 16, my family started enduring some pretty big traumatic changes. Patriarchs, my grandfathers died. Um, there was a lot of fighting. And I should also say that growing up, there was a lot of mental illness in my family. In addition to what I was experiencing, like the rest of us, and witnessing things like September 11th. Um, the climate of our country and our world, the narratives of the environment, um, the systemic racism that I would see in the places where I grew up. And we were always taught to love one another, period. Just love. Love each other as you would hope to be loved. And that's really easier said than done. But for my family, I think it was one that was innately just there, just like hearing pitch. And so after the age of 13, with those life-changing events, I began to really think about how I could self-medicate, how I could process this stuff by way of the things that innately just made me happy. And at that time, it was creating stories. I mean, growing up, I would draw life-size little cutout paper figures. I remember I had this giant robot that I had made that was sitting next to me, and I drew it on line paper and then cut it all out, taped it together, and made this guy that was my size and had him sitting next to me at the dinner table. And so what really brought me a lot of joy in days when there was a lot of trauma and uncertainty about whether or not my family was going to be okay were telling stories and getting lost in the world. Like, and I say lost in a, not in a sense of running away, but rather just finding myself completely immersed in the worlds that I was building for myself. And anytime I got to share those worlds by way of a story with another person, that was left me in a state of ecstasy. And I think that innately goes back to that thing that's in our DNA, which is to share with one another. And so from the ages of 13 to 19 or 20, middle school into high school, it was a thing of honoring those gifts by way of just expressing them as a child would. Innately, I moved between mediums. I was, a storyteller. I was a singer. I was a performer. And a lot of these cues I took from my parents. And my parents also had a lot of huge fallouts and burnouts in those years too. My father was arrested twice, falsely accused of things, and we were very poor growing up, so we didn't have a lot of resources. But out of that, my brothers and I and my sister, I'm the oldest of four, we loved one another, and we played with one another, and we fought with one another. And by having that little pack of wolves, in the woods of North Florida, I think we found a connection to nature, a reverence for all things living, um, and used our imaginations and limited resources to create new narratives and stories. So, in a lot of ways, moving into the storytelling aspects and writing the stories I was writing between 13 and 18, it was just taking that whole process and moving it forward another notch. And in those years, I had a number of people come into my life who were heroes of mine, who were, in pop culture, but also at home in my immediate community. Teachers, friends of the family, um, that embodied things that I respected, whether it had to do with the discipline of productivity and intensity of expression. Um, and so, on another note, I would also invite you to write out those people who are heroes of yours that embody aspects that you want to embody. And identify with each of these heroes and mentor figures and parents, both blood related and chosen parents and brothers and sisters. Write out the attributes that you respect in them and how those reflect on you. Um, and so, moving into high school, I formed a band, and I had this vision of creating a series of narratives that would span graphic novelization, theater, music. I was heavily inspired by Nine Inch Nails, specifically Trent Reznor, in the way in which his intensity came through with that precision of music. So he was the first person I fell in love with as a musician. I'll rewind and say that growing up, my father produced concerts and events in Florida, and so I had a chance to meet incredible musicians and singers when I was between the ages of 2 and 7 that otherwise I wouldn't have had access to. Um, and all of this stuff definitely influenced my walk as an artist. So then, moving right along, um, by the time I got into my high school years, it started to really become clear that this was something I wanted to do with my life. I didn't necessarily feel drawn to other vocations, and of course, with the pressures in high school of getting a degree and going to college and doing the whole thing, I was like, I don't know, I don't want to do that. I just want to create my stories and move people. That's really what I want to do. What's the path to doing that in a way where I can reach as many as possible? And also, being or what's the word I'm looking for here? Seduced, I should say, by uh, the temptations of fame and all that that brought along. And for me, from a pure sense, it was, wow, I want to be able to move millions of people. I would love to have that feeling to collectively. Um, and so when it came time for graduation, I had taken art classes at my high school, had received awards for highest honors in the arts. And that for me was really validating because up to that point I had a pretty low self esteem. I didn't think much of myself, and I also was pretty self conscious about my life in general because of the stuff I'd come up through. So I didn't really think that I had anything that I deserved to say, that anybody would care to listen to. So when I had my high school art teacher, Marilyn Proctor, award me with this Advanced Placement Art Award, I cried walking down the aisle at the auditorium in shock because I was like, what? I figured I would get out of here by the skin of my teeth and whatever. And that was a huge affirmation from life to keep on that path. So then by the time I got into college, I was already full swing on writing out the literal narratives of these stories. I was designing the characters. My portfolio that I used to get into art school at Florida State had many scenes that I had drawn and painted and sculpted depicting this world. I'd formed a band. I was performing out locally at clubs in North Florida. And I went with Mom to Florida State because I had no idea about school. I had a Bright Future Scholarship, which is the thing they give to kids who get good enough grades, but you had to stay in state. So I went with her to Florida State one day to the art department, and sitting there was this woman, Phyllis Strauss, who was the academic advisor, and she was at that time in her late 60s, early 70s. And her history was that she was a civil rights attorney who defended and won some pretty high profile civil rights cases in Florida. Retired at 60, went back to school, got a master's in sculpture, had had 4 children who were all adults by this point, and now she was doing an academic advisory at the school and making these life-size metal sculptures of animals and people. And I remember sitting in her office and being so affirmed by her. And the courage that woman had really was good for me because I had none. I was very self-conscious about what I was doing. And so I sat there and she flipped through and gave me critique, but was just building me up. So I walked out of her office that day saying, I want to come here just to sit in her office at least once a week if I can. Another hero was her. And, points that come up for me with her are her courageousness, her clarity of vision, her willingness to fight for what she believes in. And she would do that for students like me, and going so far as to change grades in the system because she regarded academia as a bunch of bullshit for many of us who were not cut for that cloth. And I remember a few times she'd go in and she would change grades for undergraduate classes that were just essentially, hoop jumping things, where to mark off the credits on the sheet. And her attitude of dancing between playing by the rules but then also knowing when to break the rules really was a pivotal moment for me. Another hero that came out of that environment was this guy Jim Roche, who had cut out a really extraordinary career for himself in the 70s. He had done these really controversial audio recordings at the height of racial tension in America. He'd done life-size installations addressing environmental issues, and all of it was an extreme rawness of vision, which I desperately needed. And he became like a father figure for me as an artist. And when I had my graduate show, he called me out of the blue to congratulate me on it. He gave me some critique, but just, again, boom, really just sent me out the door floating. And with that entire time, I'll also say that the school I went to didn't necessarily teach formal technique. It was more about giving it, you had to audition, you had to show that you had innate talent. Then they'd give you a studio if they all voted you in, where you were left to your own devices, which was perfect for me. A lot of people had a hard time with that one. But I had the story as my tethering purpose, the thing that drove me. And so in that regard, I used that studio space to try things, to experiment. And I would show professors, and they would give their feedback, things that I might have been doing, we'll just say wrong, even though, I say that jokingly almost. But the biggest one that I came away with in those days was to dig deeper. We all have our influences. And the biggest piece of advice that I was able to walk away from that was invaluable was to do the homework. You like that? Find out who made that, and find out who liked that and then made that, right? So digging back into the etymology of ideas. And this was a big one for me because in many ways, growing up, I was sheltered from a lot of things in the world. And so a big part of my teenage years and adolescence was just thrusting myself into the things that scared me the most, because I wanted to know more about myself. I wanted to know about these aspects of life. And so I found myself in situations that were quite dangerous at times, or quote unquote scary, but it was all about informing my life experience so that I could distill it into my narrative, into my stories, my artistry, in ways that was compelling and because I, at the end of the day, wanted to be able to create things I was excited about that other people resonated with too. And then this was all amplified by the time I came to the end of my time at Florida State, where I had Cirque du Soleil knocking on my door. I had a number of big institutions in the state of Florida trying to lure me in for master's programs. But school didn't feel true at that point. I really wanted to just get out in the world and start sharing the work that I had been developing over the years. And so by the time I graduated, I went to New York, knocked on the doors of 40 galleries, and in terms of listening, I took the advice of Phyllis and Jim on how to present a portfolio, making sure that all the work that I was creating was finished work, um, and then also strategies on how to get in with the right kind of curators. Uh, you know, uh, applying using online tools for juried exhibitions that had people who were um, of note in the art world who would see the work and then champion it potentially. And so I did that. Went to New York, got rejected by all 40 galleries I went to go see in Manhattan. And then I went to Texas because Jim had gotten his master's or doctorate from the university at Dallas. So I went and I met people. I immediately found it to be a dramatically different environment there. People were less jaded, and there was definitely fertile ground to develop as an artist and also show at a professional level. So at that time, I had my first group show in Marfa, Texas in 2008, where I had done a series of life-size cutout kids. And I should say that between 2006 and 2008, I had left my band and my security net of the community I'd built up in Florida to go out on my own and try to figure out what this itch was that I was trying to scratch. Um, that being said, it was really a trying time because of the fact that I remember finding myself being completely stifled. I still had this story that I wanted to tell, these series of stories I wanted to tell. I had these aspirations for having huge shows in arenas and juried exhibitions and museum and gallery level exhibitions, but I barely had that which I had made in college, which was definitely a noteworthy body of work, but not much else. I had a computer my brother built for me, a Shure 58 microphone, and a pirated copy of Adobe Audition. But was just feeling really depressed and frustrated because I had essentially hit the eject button on a really beautiful community of people in Florida, knowing that it was only the first step of what would be many stages of my development. And one of the big things that came up at that time was the Julia Cameron book, The Artist's Way. Her words really rocked me at that time too. It was really a huge about face in the sense of how she was able to overcome her writer's blocks. At that time, I was started auditioning for acting roles. I landed an agent. I was trying acting out. I was working 2 or 3 different part-time jobs to make money, but all of it was because I wanted to do this thing with my artistry. And a big pivotal point too, along with The Artist's Way, was a quote from Nietzsche, which was I found in a fortune cookie. It was, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." And I taped that to my desk because it was like, oh man, I got to figure out why I need to make art. And this was a message that kept coming up, toward the end of my time at Florida State on into this period of my life. Good art comes from a need. And I remember going back right before I left Florida, I went over to Phyllis Strauss, my academic advisor, to her house a few times. And she took me around her property. And on her property in the woods of Lloyd County in North Florida were life-size horses that represented her and her mother and her sister who had died in an abusive relationship. She had her 3rd son buried on her land with a sculpture of her body kneeling over his grave. She had another installation of 7 women who represented her and all the women in her family dancing around the youngest, which was a newborn girl of one of her sons, a granddaughter. And all of it, I remember at that time, it really was another life-changing moment where I saw in her work why she made what she made for no one else but herself. And another part of Jim Roche's contributions to my life was to expose me to what's called outsider art or folk art. People who were making out in the woods with no other influence, no training, and no other reason except to self-soothe a loss um, or a major change in their life. Um, and seeing that rawness of vision and seeing that fierceness of vision resonated with me much more deeply than any of the highbrow artists that I was being exposed to. And I'll say, in addition to that, that many of my favorite people are people like Anselm Kiefer, who I would consider to be an artist who came out of academia. However, people like him were able to take that rawness of vision and dance with the parameters and the systems of the art world. And that was always my interest. I wanted to find a way to move within and without, so that, at the end of the day, I'm still making work like this for myself. Um, so going back into the years before my first art show, 06, 07, I began reading Julia's book. And one of the things she prescribed was the morning pages. 3 pages of whatever the hell was in your brain when you woke up. Get it on paper in a journal, close it, put it away, don't look at it. So I began doing that. The Nietzsche quote came in that time. I also felt that compulsion to keep digging, to keep seeking and searching, looking what other people were doing. Battling depression, battling anxiety, and using my artistry as a way to do that. So I would move from singing, working on a song, and then if I got tired of that and I couldn't go any farther, I'd move to doing a painting for an art show. And starting very simply, where I would exhibit locally. I moved to Austin because it was a nice center. It was cheaper than Houston or Dallas, but at that time it was anyway. And I could go to either of these major art cities in an hour or 2 or 3 and be able to show my work. But that first show came by way of driving out to Marfa and introducing myself to a gallery one of whose owners was a former student of Jim. And at that time, I had been developing these children. I was doing these cutouts like the ones on the wall here, but they were all freestanding. My graduate show was a series of 32 life-size or so children dressed in Scandinavian clothing because that was a part of my family history. My dad's Swedish. And I was playing with ancestry and meaning and symbol and so I thought, okay, I'll continue with that, but just take that to a further degree. And driving out and feeling the earth speaking in West Texas and turning my headlights off at 11 p.m. driving out to Marfa and being illuminated by the starlight, I was pulling directly from that environment at that time. And so I painted these kids that were lit in starlight like they were out in the hunt and they were tired and yearning and lonely. So it was just pulling out all that anxiety and grief and longing that I was feeling in myself and putting it to these figures. And on the backside of each of them, I wrote out memories of painful memories, sorrowful memories, and really was just releasing those parts of my psyche into the work. And this all came out of the practice of writing every morning. I was writing and writing and writing. And I knew that with what would become House of Stone, the intent with that work was to use it as a means of personal alchemy, to take my own trauma and grief and family experience and redeem it by way of these stories of characters. And that was my why. My why was I want to work on this, and spirit, and allow that stuff to find its voice through my creative expression. And so that first show was critically acclaimed. I sold a piece, and had a huge collector in Texas put his name on 2 things, and which was exciting. And then they walked away from it because they got in a fight with their wife. And okay, but I was in it. I was in the game, And it was such an affirming thing to see that work come directly out of unblocking my brain by way of writing. And many of us aren't really writers. However, I can speak to the idea that by putting it on paper, for me personally, it was truly an unraveling of thought. And I think of the mind like a room that's cluttered and full of boxes. We have all these histories, life experiences. And it's been for me over the years a practice of when I feel myself really blocked and I need to unblock, I'll pull out one of my journals and just start writing. And my writing practice started out, line by line, writing out the thoughts. And then it evolved into a piece like the one here on the wall, which this was a performance piece where I sat in the center of it. And as I sang and built my music, I was writing whatever I was going through in that moment, what was swirling around in my brain. I just wrote it out. And I denied my ability to reread it by way of writing over top of it. So my journal entries these days look more like that. And again, that's kind of another step in distilling the content into something that can be appreciated for its ambiguity, in addition to and in league with its depth of content. And so with that first show, I had Art in America do an interview with me for the Texas Biennial, and then felt all this pressure to keep producing in this way. One of the big pieces that came through the Julia Cameron book was to focus on the quantity of work and let God or whoever you have a relationship with in terms of spirit focus on the quality. And that was a wonderful thing for me. So I began focusing on less on, really detailed, thought out installations, because I was doing huge installations in spaces. And I focused more on just mark making. So I remember doing a series of drawings where I would write out a phrase and I would outline it and outline it and outline it and outline until I started to see the inklings of a creature. So I'd draw like a little head or a leg. And these meditative drawings were an active practice of focusing on just making the marks. And it was wonderful because it really helped me, like good breath work, to condition my state of being to just focus on showing up and making a little progress each day. So these drawings would take me sometimes years. And so much of my work became more about the process than it did about an end result. And I think that's a big one, especially moving through life, is that being in touch with what we need to do right then and there. When I was first creating work, I was doing photorealism, and I got hired to do, photorealistic paintings of animals for a furniture company in Georgia, and was really, really enamored with the ability to render something as closely to reality as I could. And that was a niche that I needed to scratch in those days. And these days I can still do that, but that's not necessarily where the need is for me. And the need for me was about focusing on my mental state and my emotional state by way of process. So largely the work between 2008 and 2010 or 11 became about process. The pieces on the wall behind me, the two children saluting, those were originally pieces of a door that I cut up, and I used earth from the yard that I lived in, the house in Texas, in Austin, to create texture. And then over the course of 3 or 4 years, I would just slowly drip different watered out pigments along those to create this sort of look like you're looking at a satellite image of Alaska, which was inspiring me at the time. A lot of my work has very much been drawing from the earth and the state of the earth and the connection to it, the reverence for it. And I should also say that, for me as a creative, it was always about moving between mediums, not putting too much pressure on just creating visual work. For me personally, it made more sense to, work on a song one day, and then that song might spark something visual. So I'd immediately stop that, pull out the drawing thing, and start working on the drawing, and let all that work in complement to one another, and in support of one another. And of course, throughout this entire time, I will say that there were so many days where I just sat there staring with tears in my eyes because I was so frustrated that I couldn't produce in a way that I had wanted to produce, my expectations for myself, and was really hard on myself in those days. Why aren't you getting up earlier? Why aren't you working harder? And a lot of that was about expectation. You know, these ideas of expectation I had in my mind, what I wanted to achieve by the age of 25 or 35. You know, and so then up to about 2010, I'd been composing all of this music for what would be House of Stone. I'd had, God, probably 180 to 100 motifs and songs fully fleshed out, and sketches of music, and also artwork that complemented that story. And as I kept showing out in the art gallery world, I met this guy, Kevin Nakan, who essentially became a brother, a big brother, a tour manager of sorts, and another one of my allies in this whole thing. Someone who was very encouraging to me and was building me up. I owe him a lot because he came to my bedroom studio where he saw me working on this music using objects that I had in my space and that Shure 58, and was like, we got to get this out in the world. So he helped me to put together. I had my song structure for how I wanted House of Stone to go, but it was something like 20 songs, and we cut it down to 13 so it could be packaged as a record at that time. And between those years, I was going to New York and visiting with other musician friends of mine, a buddy Rick Sheridan, who was another big brother. I got to play the House of Stone when it was still a demo for him and Kirk Douglas, the guitar player for the Roots, who came in and just improvised over the entire record on a little amp and this beautiful Les Paul that he had just picked up that day. And that was inspiring for me to be able to sit that close to a musician of that excellence. So going back to heroes, I think about those people and what they embodied, and how they selflessly were just building me up, but also in their practice. And this is, to me, I think, a thing that's important to seek out in life, is to be ever the student and to be ever the teacher. Never being so jaded to think that you've seen it all, or that you know it all. Always being willing to show up, even if you're feeling particularly closed. To continue to open up under any circumstances. That's another need, another why for me. And so one of the notes Jim Roche wrote in one of his catalogs right before I left Florida was, remember, if you hold back, you stay back. And those words always rang through my ears. And I remember in those days I was really wanting to finally take House of Stone out on the road and start getting it into the ears and eyes and hands of people. And my strategy was I wanted to align with the artists that inspired me, the ones who were doing things with their music that I responded to because it felt like it was on the trajectory of what was relevant now and what would be relevant. And I was also after creating something that could be as timeless as it was timely. And so then I managed to get one of these records in the hands of the guys with TV on the radio, because they were friends of a friend. And mustered up the courage. I was like, yeah, I know I'm like every other dude who's handing you a record, but I feel like you would appreciate this. No worry if not, but here. And then about a month later, I got a beautiful email from the singer Tunde's wife, and talking about how she and he had listened to the record on a Sunday while they were cleaning their house and were just in love with it. And so I became friends with those guys, and they invited me out for a fall tour in 2011. And so really, I think by the time 2010 hit, I had attracted, by way of just going out and humbly showing my work in any place that would have let me show it, backyards of friends' houses for a party, or a restaurant who was doing, in Austin in those days, live music and things like that was very much supported by businesses. And so it attracted the kind of people that responded to the work. And so I had around me a young collective of artists and musicians and people who were interested in building their own promotion companies and things like that, who gave of their time and energy to just build this thing up. My vision was still very clear. I wanted to have theatrical presentations. I wanted stage shows and music venues. I wanted to show it in art galleries. I wanted to have a series of films that, pulled out all the stops in terms of budget and spectacle to create this world. And so, while building upon this practice of showing up every day in my studio, even if I, turned out what I thought was crap, I didn't judge it. I just kept on showing up. And we began to tour this work around. In that time, too, I met a young graduate from UT who was pursuing a degree in radio, film, and television, but he had really resonated with the work and wanted to help me create a short film that basically showcased this world. So we went out to West Texas and filmed this artsy 11-minute piece with a young crew of filmmakers and called it Children of the Black Mountain, and it was a compliment that came along with House of Stone. And so, his name is Javier Avellán. All of those people in those days were so integral to helping me to launch this thing, and we were all doing it from labor of love. Any money I made, I'd pour it back into the project, or I gave it to people if I could. And while we were touring, and I was still working part-time jobs, I was continuing to write music. I was continuing to create work, not necessarily for that, but just making it. And that's my practice, is I'll make and make and make, focusing on the quantity, not the quality, and just put it away on hard drives or put it away in folders, and then every so often I'll go back and look through it, and I'll pull out things that, oh man, I don't remember making this, but this is great. So, even to this day, I still am recording little motifs and sketches, and currently I have a folder of 700 or 800 of these that I've been storing away for years. And really between the years of 2011 and 2014, it was full-on tour mode. I'd had several major romantic relationships, fall apart in that time as I was committed to this thing, which was incredibly difficult. Being motivated by way of that stuff and through the loss of love was a huge part of my growing pain, and being able to use that stuff as material and as fuel and not be too smothered by it, even though at times I was bedridden for days, like any of us would be when we're in love. And really that whole time, a big one was like, I'm not getting there fast enough. Which was me wrestling with this unrealistic thing of entitlement and expectation, the mark of achievement that I thought was important. And life always has ulterior motives for us, I think, and we may very well get to achieve the things that we hope for, but maybe not in the ways we intend. And I think that's a really important thing to remind ourselves of, that, the plans are always written in sand. And so in those years, it finally came to a point where I even named a tour breakthrough in 2013 and was paying out of pocket for the expenses and going into debt just to keep going. And my worst fear at that time was breaking down in the middle of a tour to the point where I couldn't just fix the van that we were using. And that happened in Salt Lake City. And it was really, again, going back to the thing of life being merely an aspect, this physical life of symbol and metaphor, and really this commitment, this covenant with spirit, and my pursuit of spirit and what Spirit was calling for. Those things were coming um, into full focus in that time. So during that breakdown, I sent one guy home on a bus to Austin. The other guy and I stayed in a house that a fan had opened up. She'd gone out to San Francisco, and we basically used that house for I think a week and a half while I was trying to get the van fixed. The engine died, and I was like, "All right, life, I'm here. What now?" And I found a bike in the backyard, fixed it up. It was an old burner bike, and inflated the tires. It rode, and so I spent that entire time just riding around Salt Lake, listening to music, and just in a state of prayer. What are you trying to say to me? Spirit. And so I remember at the time I had a real thing for the Madonna, specifically the Black Madonnas found in Europe. I was really interested in the histories of that as a part of my homework, my research, my digging, and found myself at 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street looking at this huge mural of a Black Madonna on the side of this building, who later I found out was the artist Retna who made that in LA. At the time I didn't know that, so I just stood there enamored by this beautiful painting of this Black Madonna. And there's a kid in the barefoot painting in the street. And I walk up and talk to him a little bit, and he's this Rembrandt quality oil painting. And he's like, "Hey, I'm John Paul. Come on up into our artist studio." And there were about half a dozen or so incredible painters up there. And they were all currently doing lessons under the mentorship of this older artist whose name was Sky Jones, a local guy who, was just as much trickster as he was an artist, and there's all kinds of Venn diagram overlaps with that stuff. But I remember that very night, I sat there on the floor doing these quick drawings where we started by drawing our name first, affirming that the piece would be done before we even made a mark, making it a rectangle, and starting with the biggest blacks we were using Sharpie markers, and working our way backwards to negative space. And it was all gestural, very abstract. There was nothing concrete. And he kept saying, after 400, you'll start to see things come in. Then after 600, you'll see more. Then after 1,200 of these, more epiphanies will happen in your drawings. And I was in tears drawing. I had 22 of these already, knocked out. And that whole time, I remember feeling my artistry just being so closed. The mental blocks that year were so great. There were a lot of other narratives going on, getting involved with other people romantically, my own imposition of what I thought I should be achieving at that point in my career, interpersonal dynamics between my band at the time, the management that I had, the very people I was surrounding myself with. And I really believe that whole thing was a moment where life was bringing me to a halt to really reassess and reconnect with my why. And so I did those drawings. I was feeling like these layers of mental blockage were being pulled away by way of just drawing without thinking about how good it was or who would see it. We climb up on the roof and there's fireworks going off. And I asked my bud John Paul, my new friend, what's the deal? There's people lined up, camped out, and all this on the street. He said, this is the day that Brigham Young brought the Mormons into this valley. And that was July 24th, which is my birthday. And I turned 30 that day. So I was like, all right, I get it. Which I thought was all really beautiful and hilarious. And it was really a rebirth of my artistry. And I remember ending the relationship that I was involved with at the time. It was a long, tangled mess. I called her as lovingly as possible, ended that thing, and then made the commitment to let go of the management, to let go of the band, and get back in touch with the why for me. And I remember having a dream that night that I was dancing on water. And so I began doing these quick drawings religiously under his advice, this guy, Sky Jones. Eventually got the van fixed, really achieved a series of acrobatic feats of flying to San Francisco to film a piece for another band's music video, flying to Florida to visit my grandmother for her birthday, then flying back to Salt Lake to pick up the van that I ended up spending thousands of dollars to repair. But the beautiful thing that I had with Sky was he flipped a coin. Will Morgan get the van covered by Sears, who was at fault for the damage in the first place? Tails, no. Will this be a tuition, an invaluable tuition that he's paying for in his life? Yes. It was amazing. And so I, of course, handed the credit card over to the people who fixed it with a trembling hand, thinking, okay, that's it. Here we go. But it ended up getting to the next festival. My band guys met me up there. It was beautiful. We were alive. And it was, again, another little gentle reminder of the fact that, money, the physics of this life is really, in so many ways, symbolic. They're just pieces. They're moving pieces, and they're always in motion. And while I grew up in an environment where I was constantly afraid that we weren't going to have a house, that we weren't going to have enough money, it was life reminding me to stay open and to stay fluid and to move with anything that came my way. And so ended up completing that tour, did 40 dates nationally with these guys, and then at the end of that, I think we were just like, all right, let's take a break. We're going to go our separate ways and take a break from because we were touring relentlessly since 2010, and it was now 2014. And we'd achieved a lot of amazing things in that time. Dean Cote was my drummer, and Kevin Nakan was also a drummer, tour manager, and running samples of stuff that I was recording for House of Stone. And the three of us really were a little pack. And so then moving into 2015, 2014 into, I'd say probably 2020, I committed to finishing the House of Stone saga. So I had released the first record, which was 13 songs, and started to work on a sophomore record because of the pressure I was receiving to make another album. And I said, you know what? No, I'm not going to do that. I went so far as to fulfill a Kickstarter for that second record, and I wrote everybody saying, here, I'm changing direction. This is more true to what I need to do. I've got to just pursue this thing and honor the vision of it. And so I committed to give everybody who donated to the Kickstarter all 5 forthcoming volumes that would be, basically gap fillers for the House of Stone story. So you have House of Stone, and then within it fits these 5 chapters. And over the course of the next 5 years, I released a record every 6 months. At that point, I stopped driving for tours for the most part. I did a couple of West Coast runs, but I would just fly to the gigs. And also the other thing that came out of this was beginning to do loop-based meditative performances. And that came by way of law of attraction. I was out there doing the thing, and I had companies like TC Helicon who make voice loopers and things approach me about giving me an endorsement. And so I used that, and I started using it to do these durational things, which then again, that also was working more with process, not focusing on writing a song, but just adding layers and enjoying the process of adding layers and feeling the intervals and the play of melody. And these things became experiences that people would show up for. And I would sing from sunset to sunrise doing this. And it was a similar practice of just scratching the itch. This was the need. It helped my mental state, my emotional state. And it also kept me limber vocally and performatively. I'd just show up, no plan, and just start crafting right there on the spot. And so I'd say, between 2015 and 2020, it's been that. And the big one was in finishing House of Stone. The last, I called them deaths. The last death was in 2018. I released it that spring. And I remember crying at the end of it, like, wow, that was a 10 to 15 year cycle of emotional, mental, spiritual alchemy that I was working through. And that work is no longer serving me in that way anymore. So it was really just saying thank you and farewell to it. And as of 20, I guess in completing that, I've been in a state of listening for what's coming next. I'm in a state currently about that really is about being still and focusing on showing up and creating. A lot of the work these days is collaborative. I'm working with heroes of mine, people that I've looked up to, like Saul Williams, Tunde Adebimpe, my bud Robin Fink. And these are people that years ago I thought I would love to work with them one day, and had to let go of those visions, really just release them and then focus on what I did. And then by way of life, honoring, they would show up. But by showing up every day and doing the practice, by focusing on the quality, just the quantity of work, by continuing to, I'm doing film scoring. I'm drawing a graphic novel for Saul. I'm doing a game project with Robin. I'm working on a number of collaborative things with Tunde. And then my own work. I'm constantly, when I feel that little spark, I'll come in here and record a little motif. Even having conversations like this or the voice sessions, it's all about keeping the creative spirit active and working to keep expanding under any circumstances, any hardships that come. And that's easier said than done. Yeah, so I think to end with on this, and I'd love to continue to have this conversation maybe again in a month or something, but play with focusing on the quantity of work. If you don't have a journaling practice, try it out, see if it works for you. If you are looking to delve deeper into your creative artistry, write out for yourself perhaps what's the need that's feeding that particular vocation. And it doesn't have to be something creative either. It can be growing vegetables. It can be working on a house. It can be the job that you're showing up for every day. We don't all need to be a creative. We all don't need to be a singer. We can be an accountant and still have find the same meaning in that vocation, which I was an accountant for 2 or 3 years. I did HR. If it's serving in some way to provide for people that we love, if it's bringing energy into our family that is needed, if it's benefiting another person in a way that's lifting them up and you see that, those are the things to pay attention to, and taking off pressure from what you think you should be doing. Just getting in touch with what feels on a core visceral level to be true or untrue for you at that time. And don't be afraid to take risks. So I think that's probably a good place to pause for the day. If you have any questions, feel free to DM me on Facebook Messenger, or in the comments of this video I'll put an email address where you can reach out to me too. This has been recorded, so you can also go back. I'll put that link in there. Thank you for joining me for this one. It's the first of many to come. And also for the next few, if you have specific questions, things you would like to see me address, I can kind of curb the content of that next session more toward what you're after in your walk. But anyway, I hope you are sent off inspired and have a good week, and look forward to doing another one of these with you sooner than later. Have a good rest of your day.